This is a paranormal story from the Middle East. It's quite scary. I was born in Tehran. At age 6, my parents moved back to my father's hometown, where he founded a textile factory. Business was good and our family became very rich. We stayed there for 18 years before moving back to the capital city of Iran. When I was 28, I decided to go back to school again to study civil engineering. I had already graduated from the university with a teaching degree. My success there allowed me to move to a coastal city located in the northern part of Iran, where I bought a 2-bedroom detached house. The elderly couple who owned it before me had died in the home, and their bodies were discovered in a bedroom. There were signs of a struggle. The authorities determined the husband had attacked the wife. She apparently defended herself with such fury that she had broken bones in her hands. As an impetuous first-time homeowner, I wasn't concerned about the history of the property. It was move-in ready, and that's all I cared about. I slept in one room while the other was my study. Deep into the night, I was designing construction plans in the first year of university. If you're familiar with this type of work, you know that it's a time-consuming task that requires your full attention. Well, I kept getting distracted by the strange sounds that were growing in frequency. The roofs of the homes in that area were made of wooden frames, and it's not unusual to hear creaking noises when the temperature drops at night and the wood contracts, but this was different. When I heard someone knocking on the door to my study, I wrenched it open, fully expecting to confront an intruder. The hallway was empty. Tapping sounds like knuckles on a tabletop drew me into the living room, but I found no one there. I double-checked the lock on my front door and made a quick sweep of the premises. Each room I entered, the noises would shift to a different part of the house, until eventually it all became a deafening cacophony. I turned on every light in the place and reached into my closet and pulled out a machete that I kept on hand for self-defense. I turned to face my invisible opponent, but how do you fight air? I gave up and ran out the front door and through the front yard and into the street. It was winter and all I had on were shorts and a T-shirt. Given that I was wielding a machete, I must have looked like a lunatic. I ran 2 miles to my friend's place and frantically beat on his front door. Once he let me inside, I stammered incoherently about what had just happened. He was not convinced, but he offered me his couch for the night and promised to investigate the situation with me in the daylight. We returned to my house later that morning. I had left my front door wide open and was relieved that no thieves had taken advantage of that. We did a thorough search of each room and everything appeared to be untouched. My friend offered to stay the night with me for my own peace of mind. I was less afraid in the daylight, so he left me there so he could go retrieve his shotgun. Well, the day passed without incident. We decided to make a couple of pallets on the floor and sleep beside each other in the living room. Once our conversation began to drift, we both dozed off, and a loud crash like a table being upended jarred us awake. The barrage of noises felt like we were trapped inside a batting cage with a demon army of baseball players. "Grab the gun!" I yelled. "Well, what am I shooting at?" my friend demanded. We surrendered the house and stumbled out the front door. This time I slammed it shut. I stayed away for a week, and when I went back to grab a few clothes, my friend reluctantly agreed to accompany me as far as the front porch, shouting through the doorway, "Hurry up or I'm not going to stay here." In the aftermath, I suffered from nightmares. I dreamt I was back in my house when I sensed something evil coming down the hall. It had long claws that hung below its knees and left behind a trail of slime as it slithered toward me. I opened my mouth to scream, but my vocal cords wouldn't function, and I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. and the thing was leaning over me, its claws poised to strike at my neck. Well, suddenly I woke up. My friend was standing over me. "You're having another nightmare," he said. "I can't stay here forever," I told him. "I need to reclaim my house." They say spirits will continue to linger if an injustice remains unresolved, and I suspected the deceased elderly couple who once resided in the house still had a tale to tell. They had been married for over 50 years. An accident had damaged the woman's leg so severely that she had to be helped in and out of bed. Neighbors spoke kindly of the husband. The couple employed no outside help, and he remained his wife's sole caregiver. When their bodies had been discovered, the woman was still in bed, tucked under the blankets, with the man lying prone across her midsection. Due to their advanced ages, it was assumed that the stress of their alleged altercation, the evidence being the woman's broken hands, had proved too much for the both of them. But something caught my eye while reading the medical examiner's report. I returned to my friend's home that day and compiled my notes. That night I proceeded to my house alone. I slipped my key into the lock and carefully opened the door, and I went directly down the hall to my bedroom. I took a seat and produced my notes, and I began reading them aloud. And when I finished, I stripped down to my T-shirt and shorts, and I slipped between the covers of my bed, and I quickly went to sleep. It was the most fitful night of rest I'd ever had, devoid of nightmares and the unexplained noises. As long as I lived in the house, I never experienced either of those things again. While trying to help his wife from her bed, the old man had been struck down by something called a cervical artery dissection, a stroke caused by an artery in his neck leaking blood. You could compare it to the monster in my dream, whose long claws lingered, with me powerless to do anything about it. And pinned by the weight of her dead husband on top of her, the woman had slammed her hands repeatedly against the headboard in a vain attempt to summon help that never arrived. Her efforts had continued from beyond the grave. Their spirits had reached out to me with a story full of life, too scared to be tainted by a scandalous death. Oh man, what a great story. I am so glad. I've had this story for quite a while, and I'm just now getting to it. And I remember when I read it probably 6 or 8 months, maybe even a year ago. And I was so glad to get a story from someone from the Middle East. We get stories from Australia, and I have a few of those to do, and we get stories from the UK and Canada. We've had stories from the Pacific Island chains that, the Philippines, and even in the Atlantic from the Bahamas. But I have never gotten an email from, and I don't know if this man still lives in Iran, but I don't think I've ever gotten an email from someone who was born and raised and had an experience in the Middle East, and I'm really thankful for this, and it was a great story. So thank you to the writer. He gives me his name, but I'm not going to say it because he doesn't really say to use it or not. But it's a great paranormal story, and I believe it. It's very, I don't know, the way it's written just seems logical, and it's not just full of fluff. It just seems, I believe it. Let's put it that way. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Here's a good Bigfoot story I think you guys are going to like. My family lived in the Sister Creek Valley near Lewiston, Illinois, when I was 5 years old in 1955. My father was a coon hunter, and my cousin had an old black and tan coon hound that was afraid of nothing. So Dad dropped my mom and me off at a friend's house, and he and my cousin took the dog Moto, and we headed to the woods. Well, we fully expected them to be out half the night, so we were more than a little surprised when they came back after only 45 minutes. Well, as a little kid, I didn't fully understand what was happening. I saw an expression on my dad's face that wasn't familiar to me. My cousin was trembling and staring around the room with jerking and unstable movements. I didn't recognize the signs of panic back then. Even Moto was acting strange. He had a wild look in his eye and was slobbering and whimpering like he'd been whipped. Dad had to take him out to the car and put him in the trunk. We came back in. He tried to explain. Everyone sat and listened with horrified fascination as my father told us that they had heard something in the woods that they couldn't identify. Now, Dad was an avid hunter. I didn't think there was any animal that he wouldn't recognize. He said that they'd barely gotten into the woods and turned Moto loose when they heard it scream. And then he admitted that it had scared them. And I remember thinking that it must have been a real monster to scare two men like that. Well, Moto came running back to us then, Dad said, and I never saw him act like that. He was whining and slobbering and, well, Dad paused a moment trying to find the words. Well, then he tried to bite me. A collective gasp came from everyone in the room. We had a time calming him down, and even then he wouldn't leave our sides. Dad went on to say that whatever was out there screaming in the woods was getting closer, so they decided it was time to come back to the house. Someone gave my dad and my cousin each a cup of coffee, and I sat and listened while the adults took turns guessing at what could have made such a racket or scared old Moto so badly. Well, after a while, we went out to the car to go home. Moto had been so afraid that he'd managed to paw his way through the cardboard backing that separated the trunk from the inside of the car, and he was sitting in the car waiting for us. Mom and I had to share the back seat with Moto that night. Dad never did figure out what that was that screamed at him and my cousin. They never hunted that area again. Over the years, Dad would say again and again, well, I know all the animal sounds, but I didn't know that one. I'm 72 years old now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Dad's been gone for years. I'd like to think he's in heaven listening to this story being told. We didn't have any idea back then what it could have been, but I've heard enough stories in recent years that I can fathom a healthy guess. Well, I bet you can. The writer, this was such a good story. He's 72 years old now, and I hope that God is letting people do things like you suggested. You said, I'd like to think he's in heaven listening to the story being told. Wouldn't that be cool if I got there and met your father and he goes, hey, I heard you tell my story. Appreciate my son writing it, and I appreciate you reading it. Wouldn't that be cool? So thank you for the story. It was really good. Okay, this is a really good Bigfoot story, and the man is adamant about how true this thing is, and so well, let's just read it. My name is Daniel, and I'm now 58. And I swear that this story is not fiction, and it's retold to the best of my ability. It took place on a camping trip, and you could offer me $1 million to relive the experience, but I would tell you to your face, keep your damn money. It was the summer of 1984. I was with my bandmates Rick and Brian traveling back to Edmonton from Vancouver. We had taken a break from our music-related affairs to go on a camping expedition for a couple of weeks. Our truck had started to overheat, so we stopped at a Boston bar, which is not a tavern but the name of an unincorporated community in British Columbia. We found a mechanic at a gas station to check our truck. The radiator had been low on water, but thankfully it was nothing serious. We were tired, so we decided to find a spot to camp. And I asked the young mechanic if he knew of a secluded area where the three headbangers could spend the night. He suggested a place that he thought fit the bill, so much so that it couldn't be found without a map. He produced a pen and a sheet of paper, and he began scrawling a series of dotted lines and assorted shapes. The young man cautioned that the road to get there literally went up the side of a mountain, but Rick, who insisted on driving, thought this sounded awesome. The road was more like a cut line as it zigzagged up the mountain. The surface was rough with large rocks and potholes. A car would not have made it. Rick was quite determined to at least try. It was barely wide enough for our truck, and at each and every turn Rick would have to back up several times before swinging wide to make the curve. It took us over an hour to get to the top, and we wondered where this so-called road was going to lead us. There was an old, faded, beaten-up yellow sign halfway up with an obvious profile of a Sasquatch, declaring in bold letters underneath that this spot in the road was known as a Sasquatch crossing. Well, we looked at each other, we laughed it off, and we continued on. We never gave the sign a second thought. We had heard of Sasquatch, but none of us even considered, nor did it dawn on us that we were in Sasquatch territory. We finally made it to the end, and to be honest, we were relieved. Rick could not have blindly backed down this so-called road, and we were to wonder what we had gotten ourselves into. There was a gorgeous clearing that spread out before us with a large, beautiful house and an equally large, beautiful lawn. We pulled up to the front of the house and exited the truck. There was a guest book on the porch with no name, so we assumed that we were the first visitors for the day. We wandered around, perplexed as to why we saw no vehicles, and seemed very much alone. Secluded was an understatement. A man we estimated to be in his 60s approached us. We explained our predicament, and although he seemed reluctant, he said that we could stay through the night, but we had to leave in the early morning. We learned the site was not open for business and that he was alone and he wanted no trouble, so he directed us toward a dirt road that was dotted with campsites. We drove down and backed in beside the remnants of a fire pit. The place was serene, with mountains surrounding us, and on top of it all, a small lake which was teeming with leaping trout. It was Shangri-La, and almost too good to be true. We set up our camp, and we went to the lake, with our rods in hand, anticipating a stir-fry of trout and potatoes later that night. And once the sun set and our bellies were full, we added a little wood to the fire and we waited for the stars. There wasn't any light for miles, and after an hour of stargazing, we called it a night. The fire was now pretty much out, and the embers were barely glowing. I put the lid over the large cast-iron fry pan on the grill, and I grabbed a rock the size of a football, and I placed it on top so no critters could steal the leftover trout while we slept. We had mounted onto the truck a primitive wooden box-like camper made out of plywood and 2x4s. We gave it a cool camo paint job for the trip, and once inside, we slid the latch to secure the doors and crawled into our sleeping bags, and we drifted off. Well, I had no idea what time it was when something woke me up. Rick and Brian were sound asleep. I could hear animal noises. It was maybe a bear or a cougar or a coyote, I thought. I could feel small tremors through the bed of the truck as I determined something massive was walking around the vehicle. Each footstep reverberated like the ripples on the pool of water. The breathing was deep and intermittently low. There were guttural sounds. I marveled at how Rick and Brian could sleep through all this. I decided they weren't going to, and I elbowed both of them awake. Well, groggy and disoriented, they quickly realized, as I did, that something outside was stalking us. You could sense that whatever it was, it could smell us and knew we were inside, and it was circling the truck like it was looking for a way in. We all had our knives out, and our backs to the cab, and our legs drawn up as far to the latch door as possible, and we were too scared to even utter a word. There was no way out. I could feel Rick and Brian on either side of me shaking. Whatever it was big, and it kept lurching around the truck and thumping the steps and breathing and grunting, absolutely terrorizing us. Well, this was a horror movie, and all of us shared equal billing. And then it rattled the door. Whatever it was wanted inside. Rick aimed our lone flashlight at the feeble wooden latch. I expected it to snap off at any moment, followed by the door being ripped from its hinges and whatever it was to come rampaging inside. Who would it go for first, Rick or Brian? I'm the clever one, I thought. I can't die like this. It walloped the door and all of us flinched. It was angry now, and the wooden box began shaking as if the beast was trying to rip it from the truck. Rick dropped the flashlight and watched it roll across the floor, and it hit the door and it went out. Maybe dying was less painful in the dark, I thought, and I said a silent prayer. And then it grew quiet, and the truck stopped shaking, and we sat in silence the remainder of the night. The sun rose and beams of morning light were streaming through the seams of our wooden box. I can't say who moved first or who opened the door. It kind of bugs me that I can't remember, but we all very slowly emerged from the camper. I walked over to the fire pit and I grabbed the rock off the frying pan. The fish were gone. We must have looked silly packing things up as if our lives depended on it. We hopped in the truck and we drove up toward that house. The old man was sweeping the front porch. Rick stopped the truck and rolled down the window and asked if anyone else had checked in after we had. The man shook his head. "Hey, did you hear anything strange last night?" Rick asked. The man replied that he was a heavy sleeper. Well, we left it at that. We went on to do battle with the road that brought us up the mountain. As we pulled up past a battered sign reading Sasquatch Crossing, I mentioned to my bandmates that what a great title that would be for an album. They couldn't tell if I was serious or not. I wasn't sure either as Rick eased our truck with its battered wood box camper down the road away from the unspeakable things that go bump in the night in the woods. Oh man, that's a great story. I love that story. British Columbia, camping in a place they've never been before, in a camper they built with 2x4s and plywoods in the back of a truck, and scared all night well, they never saw it, so we don't know if it really was a Sasquatch, but it probably was, but I really appreciate the story, Daniel. This was great. He's 58 now, so this was some time ago, 1984. The summer of 1984. I don't know, that's an experience to remember. Thanks for the story, Daniel. Hey, thanks for listening to this podcast. Just as a reminder, you guys can listen to this in another format out on the podcast network on Podbean, Apple Podcast, Spreaker, Spotify, Google Podcast, iHeart. If you'll just do a search for What If It's True podcast, it'll pop right up there at the top. And I think I have 200 or 300 podcasts uploaded there, and about 400 on YouTube. So there's plenty of material. If you enjoyed this, go back through my library and listen to your heart's content, because these are all good stories. I sure appreciate you guys, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks.